Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name's Grace. It is lovely to have you here. Today I wanted to talk about some books that I love but I have never or rarely seen mentioned online or in bookish spaces, and I really think that they deserve more attention, more love, and I want some more people to read them so that I have someone to talk about them with. I personally really enjoy reading books that I haven't heard anything about beforehand. I like to do a bit of a combination between reading books that have had a lot of hype and a lot of great reviews from people that I trust, and books that I just don't know anything about, so that I can then form my own opinions of them without any external influence. But I hope that you can find a new book from this list that you might not have heard of otherwise and sounds interesting to you. So let's get started. So the first book I'd like to talk about is Catfish Rolling by Clara Kumagai. For some context, there is a myth in Japan that states that there is a giant catfish living under the islands of Japan, and when it rolls, it causes earthquakes. This is a young adult magical realism story of a girl called Sorcerer who is half Japanese, and she was visiting Japan as a little girl when a giant earthquake struck so hard that it shattered time. Because of the force of the earthquake, Japan was fractured into these new time zones, some of which time moves faster in, some it moves slower, and some it moves at our normal speed. And during this cataclysmic event, several people were lost between the cracks of this time shift, Sora's mother included. Now, years later, Sora lives with her father near the edge of the time zones, and he works as a scientist and researcher in these zones. But the more that he explores them, the more that it seems to affect his mind and perception of reality, until one day he goes missing. At its core, this is a story of loss and grief and learning to put things back together when everything around you feels broken. The magic system, if you can call it that, is incredibly interesting and unique, and there are layers to it. It is generally accepted scientific fact in this world that there are these new time zones, though they don't yet understand how they work. But there's also more layers to it, such as this myth of the catfish, which may or may not have some grounding in reality. So as well as this being a hunt for missing people, it's also a hunt for the truth, and it ends up being quite a complex read as you try to decipher what layers of this new magical world are actually based in reality. The main character also just feels incredibly human, as well as everything they're dealing with their mother having been gone for years and their father deteriorating mentally. They also just go through relationship struggles, trying to figure out their sexuality, trying to figure out what to do with their life as they graduate from high school. And again, that just grounds all of this craziness back into reality and makes the contrast between the two even more stark and harsh. It's a very interesting, complex read that I would highly recommend, and also the cover is gorgeous, which never hurts. So that is Catfish Rolling by Clara Kumagai. Next on the list is the perfect Valentine's read, and that is If You'll Have Me by Eunnie, I think is how you say it. This is a wonderfully adorable sapphic graphic novel which made me cry as I read it on my lunch break at work. This is about a girl called Momo who's in college. She's a bit shy, she's very studious, and she bumps into another girl called PG who is known as a bit of a player on campus, but is also very charming, and Momo can't help but have a bit of a crush on. They end up becoming friends, and it starts to develop into something more, but Momo's preconceptions about PG from all of the rumors that she's heard about her kind of get in the way. This is just a lovely romance. It's so sweet, and it was really enjoyable to read a sapphic graphic novel where the main focus wasn't on coming out or dealing with sexuality, it was just a romance. Obviously those stories are important and necessary and wonderful, but sometimes you just want to read a little romance and you just want to explore normal issues amongst people who are comfortable in their sexualities and just see a romance between two people blossom. This ended up being so wholesome and so sweet and just full of so much joy. I can't recommend it enough, especially if you're looking for just a speedy dose of romantic joy during Valentine's season. So that is If You'll Have Me by Eunnie. Next up is actually one of my boyfriend's favourite books of all time, and that is Deeplight by Frances Hardinge. This is sort of a young end of young adult novel. The main character is 14, but also there's kind of cosmic horror in here. I would definitely not call this a horror book. If it were a horror book, I would not have been able to read it because I'm a huge wimp, but it definitely has elements that are inspired by that kind of Lovecraftian, immense, incomprehensible god creature. This story is set in an archipelago where these giant, terrifying gods have all died and their parts are harvested to be sold largely for kind of mechanical purposes. The main character, Hark, is a street urchin and scavenger, and one day his best friend Jelt gets him into trouble, and when he gets caught he ends up, for his crime, having to basically go and do community service at an old folks home, except this is a home for ex-priests of the dead gods whose minds have been rattled by the fact that their gods have all died. So it's a very strange place. But one day Jelt shows up again and persuades Hark to go on one last dangerous hunt for something that will hopefully make them very rich. But when this mission goes wrong, Jelt ends up being influenced by something of the deep and changed into something that Hark doesn't recognize. The main theme that I would say that is explored in this is toxic friendships and how difficult it can be to extricate yourself from that kind of relationship and learn to live for yourself. I really enjoyed that exploration because I think it's something that isn't explored as much as I would like it to be, especially in young adult fiction. And this is also a great young adult fantasy for people who don't really want to read a romance. There was a character who was introduced in here where I thought it might go in that direction, but I was really glad that it didn't. There is also a lot of deaf representation in here. I obviously can't speak to how well it's done, not being deaf myself, but from the acknowledgements in here, it seems like Frances Hardinge has done a lot of research and consulted a lot of deaf people to make sure that that part of the story is representing the deaf community as well as it can be. So that was really interesting to see as well. And overall, the world building here is just terrifying and beautiful at the same time. I was so enthralled by the mythology and lore of these dead gods and that line between love and fear that the people had for them. Frances Hardinge's world building is something that I really admire, and I really want to read some of her other works because I know that she's written quite a few books now. But I definitely highly recommend this one. So that is Deeplight by Frances Hardinge. The next book is Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho. This is set in Regency era Britain, where one of the main characters, Zacharias Wythe, has just been elevated to Sorcerer Royal because of his magical prowess. But the other magicians in society are not happy about this because Zacharias is a freed slave instead of being one of the gentry who is usually put up for this kind of position. He's also in trouble because magic seems to be dwindling in Britain at the moment, and of course he's the perfect scapegoat for the gentry to place the blame on for this. So he decides that he needs to travel to the border of fairyland to figure out what's going on. But in the process, he bumps into a woman called Prunella, who happens to have a great magical gift of her own, which is also a big no-no in these times because it's not very ladylike, and women are supposed to suppress any magic that they end up with. The two of them together end up navigating these fraught political waters. This is a very Austen-like read in writing style and in character study. If you are an Austen fan, then you'll know that one of her greatest strengths is her exploration of character foibles and just pulling apart the peculiarities of human nature and finding the humour in them. And that is something that Zen Cho is also really wonderful at doing. So it makes this book pretty funny in a lot of places. One thing I will say is this is quite a slow read. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this one if you're looking for a fast-paced, action-packed fantasy, but the writing in here is just delightful. And it also has a lot of really interesting exploration of colonialism at this time and quite complex layers of privilege between the two main characters, because they both have reasons that they're discriminated against, but also have contrasting reasons where they might have privilege within this society. Prunella is a very headstrong young woman, you might say, which is always one of my favourite types of character to read about, especially in a setting when they're not allowed to be that kind of person, but they choose their own path anyway. So I'm definitely due a reread on this one, and I would love to read some more of Zen Cho's writing in the future because they are very talented. So that is Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho. The next book I don't actually have with me because I listened to it on audiobook, but I could really do with getting my own copy of this one because it was one of my favourite books of last year, and that is Imogen, obviously, by Becky Albertalli. Now, I know that Becky Albertalli wrote Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda, which was then turned into the film Love, Simon, and I know that that one was very popular back in the day, but I don't think that this one has had anywhere near the same amount of hype, and I think that it deserves it. This is a young adult coming-of-age story about Imogen, who is the world's greatest ally to her queer friends and family, but she's straight. She's definitely straight. One of her best friends has recently come out and then moved away to college, where she's found a whole new group of cool queer friends, and she invites Imogen to visit her on campus. But when she gets there, she admits to Imogen that she's told all of her college friends that they used to date. So Imogen has to pretend to be queer. But the more time she spends with Tessa, one of these college friends, the more she begins to wonder if she's actually pretending anymore. This story deals with so many themes and so many issues in what for me was just the perfect way. It talks about the idea of not feeling gay enough to be part of the community. It talks about the self-doubt and constant internal questioning that a lot of bi girls and just queer women in general go through, and also the ways that bi people often have to justify themselves within the queer community and stand up for their own identities when it should really be a safe space for them. I really didn't go into this book expecting to feel any type of way about it. I just thought it would be a fun young adult read, but oh man, it made me cry. I had two favourite books last year and this was one of them. I just felt so seen, and I would highly recommend this story, especially if you feel like you might be able to relate to any of those issues. Just seeing the thoughts that I have had in the past written down like that and expressed in such a clear way by someone else felt so reassuring and comforting. So cannot recommend this one enough. That is Imogen, obviously, by Becky Albertalli. Next up is another Austen-inspired book, but wait. This is Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton, and this is like an Austen story, but if all of the main characters were dragons. This book is so wild, but also lovely, and I just need more people to read it, so I have someone to talk to about this. In this world, dragons act a lot like the gentry would have done in Regency times, with a few key differences. The main one being that size is very important in determining your public standing, and the way to gain size as a dragon is to eat other dragons. So the story begins with this family gathering around their father's body to eat their inheritance. Now, one brother eats more than his fair share of the father, meaning that the rest of the siblings don't get the part of the inheritance that they were expecting and are left with a lower stature in society. Now, from this point onwards, the story is very Austen. There's a creepy priest guy, there's two of the sisters who have a very strong bond and society believes they now need to go and find themselves a husband. There's also the looming possibility that the rest of the siblings might put forward a lawsuit against the brother who took too much of the inheritance, and the balance and sway between their societal standings and influences, and if they would be able to push this through against their brother who has a lot more power in society than they do. And I know it sounds so bizarre, but when it comes to the end of the story, it is quite light-hearted and sweet and in some ways ruthless, because they are dragons who will eat each other if it really comes down to it. But it feels like a classic Austen-like story where the people who deserve to get their comeuppance, and there are some really sweet romances in here and a delightful bond between the siblings, or most of them at least. It's also very witty in a similar way to Sorcerer to the Crown. The writing is gorgeous and funny and quirky in all the best ways. It's just bizarre in the most wonderful way. And please read it and get back to me, because I just can't believe I'm the only person I know who has read this book. I heard Austen and dragons and thought, I have to, so I hope that you guys feel the same way. But that is Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton. The final book I want to talk about is one that I have heard mentioned online a few times, but it's one of my favourite books of all time, so I don't think it's mentioned enough at all. And that is The Midnight Lie by Marie Rutkoski. This is a sapphic fantasy. I'd say it's kind of borderline between young adult and adult fantasy, but this is the story of Nirim, a half-kith girl who lives in the poor circle of her city where everyone's behaviour is heavily monitored and you can be punished for the smallest, most specific things. And if you are, you'll be taken away and tithed, which might mean that a bit of your blood is taken, or even a body part. Nirim does her best to keep her head down, but one day she ends up getting into a bit of trouble and she's taken to prison to have her blood tithed. But in prison, she meets a rakish traveller, the High Kith Sid, who, honestly, my favourite love interest name. But Sid tells her rumours of what life is like on the other side of the wall, and after they get out of prison, Nirim ends up leaving behind the life that she knows to travel beyond the walls, explore the city's secrets with Sid, and perhaps together uncover a conspiracy. Now this, again, is not necessarily one I'd recommend if you really want a high-paced, plot-based fantasy. It probably wouldn't be unreasonable to call this a no plot, just vibes kind of story, which I personally adore. But I know that that's not for everyone. There is plot in here and a mystery to be unraveled, but the real strength of this story is the beautiful world building, and the writing is just stunning and so lyrical and gorgeous, and the romance had me kicking my little feet. I loved it so much. I never thought I would be so obsessed with a love interest called Sid, but here we are. It also explores some really interesting themes of abusive relationships and compulsory heterosexuality. And I will warn you as well that this is the first in a duology, and it does end on a little bit of a cliffhanger, so if you end up enjoying this one, I would recommend having the second one on hand to hop right into. But I know I acknowledge that this is not a book for everyone, it won't work for everyone's tastes, but for me personally, I just adored it. If you want an idea of what my taste is, this is the epitome. So that is The Midnight Lie by Marie Rutkoski. So that's all the books I have to recommend for now. I really hope you found one that was new to you and maybe you're excited to give a try. I'll probably make another one of these in a bit after I've found some more hidden gems, hopefully. Like I said, I really like going in blind to stories and reading books that I haven't heard much about, so hopefully I can find some more underhyped recommendations for you soon. But in the meantime, it was so lovely to have you here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon in another video.